So without further ado, I'd like to present tonight's speaker, Professor Steve Benford.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to come along and speak. Thank you for coming along. Yes, I'm not sure I'm really a scientist, because if it has science in the title, it's probably not science, so I'm a computer scientist. And what's more, my field of interest is human-computer interaction, which puts me somewhere at the edge of, or probably just over the cliff of what is computer science. But anyway, it's a very nice thing to say, Simon. So yes, my interest is in thinking about how we interact with computers, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. And as computers are increasingly used for all sorts of cultural experiences, from art and performance, but of course to things like museum visiting and in theme parks, and just ever more widely for general entertainment in the home, all sorts of cultural applications. So this raises some quite interesting, perhaps even profound challenges for thinking about how we interact with computers. Traditionally, that idea was kind of, I suppose, dominated by the notion of usability, and I don't know how many of you have taken some introductory course in human-computer interaction, and I probably couldn't remember it even though I teach it. But some of the things that you'd have been told about would be computers, it should be quick to learn how to use a computer, and you should be able to retain that knowledge over time, and really computers should try and minimise the number of errors that you make. Oh, and it should be quite quick to perform a task, and you should probably feel satisfied with it. That was a kind of the core of what many people think usability is about. But once you start exploring cultural uses of computers, those goals get challenged quite a lot. And there's been some interesting writing in recent years in the field of human-computer interaction, which does things like celebrates the value of ambiguity as a strategy for defining interfaces. This is work by Bill Gaver. That might not seem unusual to you if you're an artist or indeed enjoy or have studied art, but in kind of terms of traditional user-centered design, the idea of deliberately making things ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations so that the user doesn't know what to do, that's quite an unusual idea. Well, all of that's a very roundabout way of framing this talk today. I want to talk about another one of these unusual ideas in human-computer interaction that emerges from working with and studying what artists do. And this is the idea, quite simply, of deliberately making people feel uncomfortable as part of the interactions. So I want to talk about why we might want to do this, draw on a few examples, give you a bit of a cookbook, that's the fun part of the talk. How might you make people feel uncomfortable, if that's your goal in life? But then give a couple of warnings, say, well, actually, it's not really just about making people feel uncomfortable, you know. It's about embedding that into some broader experience. And what's more, there are probably some ethical issues that you might like to think about on the way. So that's pretty much the roadmap. So why might we want to make people feel uncomfortable? Well, I think discomfort, used in terms of human-computer interaction, or perhaps even where computers aren't involved, can be used as a tactic, if you like, aimed at some larger values or goals. So one of these is undoubtedly the goal of entertainment. So this is a picture of Oblivion, which claims to be the world's first vertical drop roller coaster at Alton Towers. Has anyone ridden Oblivion? Great. It's a fantastic ride. And Oblivion, I think, involves elements of discomfort, both in terms of some quite extreme physical sensations as you drop and move, but also, of course, in terms of suspense and anticipation as you crank your way up the initial climb. So there's no doubt that I think discomfort can play a role in entertaining ourselves, in creating thrills and suspense, everything from watching horror films, of course, which you know about, and playing horrific games to things like roller coaster rides. So, there's nothing wrong with entertaining people. But perhaps there's more to it than that. Perhaps discomfort is also something that can be part of the journey towards enlightenment. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're trying to create an interactive work that takes on a dark theme or a difficult topic, then maybe you want to frame that work in a way that demands commitment from people or that avoids trivialising the subject. And an element of discomfort and confrontation with your own feelings can be part of that journey. And of course, as the picture suggests, there's a very long tradition of discomfort in relation to spirituality and various religious practices that again relate suffering of different kinds, fasting, asceticism and so forth, to some kind of personal focus on your feelings and your reactions and a journey towards enlightenment. So I'm going to make the claim that making people feel uncomfortable, can be part of the journey towards enlightenment. And the third and last benefit I'd offer is something about sociality, is about social bonding and rites of passage. Some of the work that we did studying people in theme parks when we worked at Alton Towers, we looked at people's souvenir practices and how you might design future souvenir systems. And people have lots of reasons for wanting souvenirs, and they have lots of stories that they want to tell with them. But one of the stories that came up quite a lot was the rite of passage, the younger family member going on their first big ride on Nemesis. And this seemed to be a kind of a common narrative that emerged for quite a lot of families that visit Alton Towers. They go there year on year. And I think there's some sense of which passing through that rite of passage, going on Nemesis for the first time, bricking it as you go up the climb, and enjoying the ride or not, that's part of being in that family. That's part of the shared experience. And there's quite a lot of literature about why do teenage boys watch horror films together. Probably lots of reasons they do that, but one of the arguments that's made is, again, it's about a shared rite of passage. So there's something about passing through discomfort. If anyone's ever had to endure some kind of management team building game out in the wilderness where you're trying to make a shed out of straws or something and live in it for a week, that's probably the same kind of thing going on. Okay, so that's my framing argument. There are three broader, lofty goals for why we might want to set out on this journey. There are many, many examples of making people feel uncomfortable as part of cultural experiences. And so let's just kind of take a few of these. We won't spend very long on it. I'm not an art historian. I'm not a games historian either. But I think a quick trawl and a long discussion with Gabriella led me to kind of take the view that you'll find a lot of discomfort in the world, certainly art, interactive art, and particularly performance work. And I think, I'm sure we could devote a whole lecture to just that. So Abramovich's works, which, landmark kind of works in the use of discomfort, involved getting the audience to use various objects on her body, or in this case, getting audience members to pass between two naked bodies on their way into the performance space. And it's not a very good picture, I apologise, but you're probably all very familiar with Stellark's work, and his work has also made a bit of an appearance in human-computer interaction. Lots of HCI people sort of know about him. He's appeared at the Big High conference that involves audiences witnessing and occasionally intervening on various things that happen to his suspended body. Also, within kind of, if you like, experimental HCI, so these are not, if you like, bona fide artworks, but they're sort of people in the HCI field who are experimenting. There are some unusual interfaces. The meat book is a tangible interface in which you manipulate raw, I think by the end of it, rancid meat in order to interact with stuff. And one of my students, not an artist, but I found it a really interesting piece of work, Joe Marshall, who's interested in interaction during motion, has a Lieberhuhn Fellowship to study that. One of his early experiments was a piece of work called I Seek the Nerves Under Your Skin, where you listen to a Patti Smith poem. It's a sort of frantic punk rant she gets into. But in order to listen to it, you have to run faster and faster and faster and faster. And he tunes it to push you to run beyond the limits of pretty much anything you should be capable of doing. So it's a bit like that running that maybe you did as a kid, where you just ran to see how fast you could run until at the end you lay on the floor and your chest hurt. And so Joe's kind of pushing, I suppose, kind of physical discomfort there. The world of entertainment, so let's moving away from kind of, if you like, highbrow arts to the mainstream, also includes lots of examples of deliberately making people uncomfortable. We've talked about theme park rides, and of course there are variants of those, such as the ghost train, which is all about scaring people. The object on the right is an $18 electric shock game controller that you can buy off the internet. I have it in my office. It's very, very useful in all sorts of circumstances. But if you use it for gaming purposes, it's a reaction timing game. Basically, the slowest person receives an electric shock, and it's enough to hurt. You don't want it to happen to you. The other variant of the game, which is more fun, the quickest person administers an electric shock to everybody else. So we could, I think, go on and do that all night, and I'm sure you could probably give me many, many examples of interactive experiences you've come across that involve similar things. What I want to do for the rest of the talk is just ground what I'm going to say in a couple of more specific concrete examples. So I'm now going to quickly introduce two threads of work that our lab's been involved in, and therefore that I know intimately and have studied and written about, that enable me to just understand, if you like, how uncomfortable interactions work in a bit more detail. So just a kind of little bit of our own stuff. And the first is a thread of work that we've been doing with Brendan Walker for 4 or 5 years. Brendan's background as an aeronautics engineer, then he went to the Royal College of Art, and he now runs a sort of design consultancy called Uriel. He consults on theme park ride design, and he also presents series for Channel 4. So he's an interesting character. We worked with Brendan on a series of projects that were essentially about thrill. Mostly about looking at how technologies might change the nature of rides at amusement parks in various different ways. And I'll just talk through a few of these, and I've got a few short video excerpts. The first projects we did with Brendan were about to build a personal telemetry system for roller coaster riders. So if you watch Formula One, sure you all do, the cars have got telemetry systems that give you data about their performance during the race, and we essentially wanted to give you data about people's personal visual, auditory and bodily reactions to what they were going through, just with the aim that somebody who wasn't on the ride could tune into this stuff and get a more intimate sense of what somebody else was going through. So this was the kind of first series of projects, and I've got a very rough, nasty bit of video, certainly nasty in terms of its quality anyway. This is the first experiment we did with Brendan, and Brendan hired out some fairly big rides at the Science Museum, and he built a kind of performance piece around selecting victims from the audience, kitting them up and broadcasting their data back to the space, and then having various people discuss that, a psychologist and a ride designer and a technician who was working on biosensors. So rough video, I'll give you a bit of a sense of it. It's a bit hard to see on the video, but top right, but every now and then is the image the audience are seeing. So it's video of her face and audio overlaid with some sort of faintly medical looking bio traces of her heart rate, galvanic skin response, how much she's sweating, and in later experiments, the movement of those two facial muscles.
Oh, this is so cool! Oh my goodness! This is amazing!
Yeah, that's enough. So, we were really intrigued by this, by the kind of richness of the media we were capturing and showing, and so we took it to Alton Towers and we ran a series of experiments, essentially using the same kit, but refining it, adding more sensors and sharpening up the video a bit, and kind of capturing this data and just showing it back to people and their friends and their families. And some of it's quite interesting. So I've just got one bit of video I'd like to show you with the permission of this guy. He was a wonderful, really nice guy. He came across to Alton Towers and he said, and I think the video suggests it's true, he thought he'd go on Oblivion, and he suggested it's the first roller coaster he'd ever been on. And I thought you might just enjoy watching the video as much as it makes my toes curl even now.
God, I'm so scared. This doesn't feel real. I'm afraid to look at the camera. I don't want to look down. It's going to be alright. Don't look down. Ah! so glad I did that.
Yeah. It's an interesting, and we'll talk more about the journey through discomfort later on, but I mean, it's an interesting moment. I think, anyone in that situation, however much they've hated the experience, is going to say the same thing in the cathartic relief, at having survived the drop. So, your emotional roller coaster that you go through is kind of quite interesting in that sense. So, we then got interested with Brendan about not only how might you take data from people and show it to spectators of a ride, the people who, as the theme parks will tell you, buy the tickets but end up holding the bags. We got more interested in could you use that data to control the ride itself. The emerging generation of roller coaster rides looks quite interesting. They look suspiciously like big manufacturing robot arms with people at the end of them, because that's what they are. There's the RoboCoaster Mark 1 at Legoland, which has got 2 seats on the end of a huge robot arm, and you can program it to move around pretty much as you want in 3D space. And you can say, I want the ride to do this, and then you can get on it. That's what the ride does to you. It's quite tense. And the RoboCoaster 2 that I haven't seen in the flesh, I certainly haven't ridden on, but I think I might like to, is a series of those robot arms, but put onto a traditional roller coaster track. Yeah? So you're now moving along a track, but the ride can position you around that in 3D space and make you do various movements around it. So the technology, the robotic control systems, are upping the ante, but I don't think people are quite sure how you would control these rides. How, if the rides can now be interactive, you're no longer just putting people on a linear trajectory track and sticking through the ride. You can now mess with them on the way through. On what basis do you do that? It used to be quite easy in the old days when you went along with the waltzers. Some fairly horrible lad would come and stand behind you, called a gaff lad, I think, in the trade, and if you're a young woman, probably would give it an extra spin until you screamed enough. Or if you thought you looked like a weedy computer nerd kind of person, nobody around here, would do the same. So anyway, we bought a small ride, a bucking bronco, and we started to think about how we could get it to respond to your bodily response to it, a human-in-the-loop robot system. And after a bit of messing around, we honed in on breathing, on breath control, as being a particularly interesting way of controlling a ride. So this is a breath-controlled bucking bronco. You wear a chest strap. It's not really measuring how much you breathe, it's measuring how much your chest moves in and out. That's not quite the same thing, particularly when you're on a ride. But it approximates it well enough. And in the Broncomatic, as it's so beautifully called, the ride starts off quite gently, and it gets worse and worse, as Bronco rides do. That's the point, to throw you off at the end. But your own breathing adds a sort of extra layer of movement on top of it. The more you breathe, the more it moves. And then you're told that in order to win, you basically have to stay on as long as possible. And what's lovely about this is it sets up a fantastic tension between control of the machine and control of your own body. So not everyone, but most people very quickly become aware of their breathing. A classic reaction first time you ride it is as the program notches up to the next level and it counts down and tells you what's going to happen in 3 seconds, 2, 1. People hold their breath. I think I want this thing to stop moving. You hold your breath, and then you get 30 seconds of this delicious feeling of realising you can't hold your breath forever. And what's more, when you let your breath out, this thing's going to kick off even more than it would have before. So it sets up this interesting tension, controlling your body and the machine in some kind of opposition to one another. So Brendan and ourselves wanted to up the ante a little bit more with breath-controlled rides and built Breathless. And Breathless is a breath-controlled swing ride. The more you breathe, the higher it swings. Except the breath sensors are now built into a rubberised gas mask. So you put on a gas mask with Wi-Fi and you breathe, and you're in this, well, some of you might, for your own reasons, enjoy wearing gas masks at home, but for many people, they're fairly uncomfortable experiences. Brendan did a bit more too. He's being a generally arty kind of guy. He was inspired by Fragonard's painting The Swing. Swing's a very interesting painting. It's an Edwardian, I think, lady who's enjoying the visceral physical pleasures of swinging through the air. She's being swung, controlled, by her husband, who you could probably just about make out in the bushes on the right. Maybe she's enjoying the visceral pleasures of being controlled. Maybe he's enjoying the pleasures of controlling her. Either way, her lover lurks in the bushes on the left, looking up her skirts as she flies past. So there's a lot of pleasure in this picture, of one kind or another. And so Brendan thought this would be a good basis for designing a ride. So in Breathless, you get to play each role. You start off as the voyeur. You reach the front of the queue, you put your gas mask on, you get to watch people swinging. Then you become the rider, you sit on the swing, your breathing controls the ride, and then after a while you realise that it's not your breathing that's now controlling the ride, but something's moved. And of course what's happening is the final role, the controller is now controlling you. After you've ridden, you then get to become the controller for the next person. So you kind of get to see this experience, I suppose, from a number of different perspectives. So, one more example, and then try and generalise some stuff out of this. So, I guess Brendan's work is pretty grounded in the entertainment, mainstream entertainment setting of the amusement park, of the theme park, the visceral thrills and spills and those kind of pleasures. So the second piece of work, I want to pick a contrasting piece of work, and this is by the artist group Blast Theory, who you may know, and we've worked with Blast Theory for a long time, since 1996, on a series of fantastic projects. And as someone who's interested in interaction design in general, they've led me into all sorts of spaces that I really just would never have thought of going into or anticipated you might look at. And one of the more recent piece of works that we did with them was Ulrika and Ayman Compliant. And this is, like a number of Blast Theory's works, it's essentially a sort of mobile experience that mixes digital media with the city, and it takes you on a sort of tour through both a digital narrative and a city space at the same time. What's interesting about Ulrika and Ayman to me is thematically it tackles or provokes you to think about the subject of terrorism. So at the beginning of the journey, you're asked essentially to choose between being interested in one of two terrorists, either Ulrika Meinhof of the Red Army faction or Ayman Collins of the IRA. And you sort of sign up to say, I'd like to follow them, not in a Twitter sense, so much as follow their stories. And then you begin this walk through the city. And as you walk, you receive a series of pre-recorded phone calls, voice mails essentially. And they're quite interesting because they combine a number of things in each one. They give you fragments of the life story of Collins and Meinhof. They also tell you what to do, where to go next. They also tell you how to behave in public space, and they sort of change their tone, I think, as the experience goes on, and they sort of talk to you in a more and more controlling way, asking you at several points if you wish to continue. And at the end, you're met by an actor who leads you to a room, and there essentially you're interrogated in a reasonably polite way, I would imagine, as interrogations go, but it is still an interrogation, and there you're asked a series of questions about what would you fight for and under what circumstances might you kill someone and so forth. So I've got some video of Ulrika and Ayman, just to give you a sense of it.
10. He pumps several more rounds into Tombs as he lies dying.
大人细只有你，我即使命干到家，准备十卡烧死，让我和大人拜晒手是用海里。
Don't be shy. It's a question we all have to answer from time to time. And today, it's your turn. What can you do for the people around you? Keep your eyes open. Act natural. There's always a first time for this kind of thing, and practice makes it easier. I'm going to count to 10. If you're still on the line when I get to 10, then I'll know where you stand. 1. The two killers ride into Warren Point on a motorbike. 2. They switch the engine off, allowing the bike to glide the last 20 metres so as not to raise the alarm. 3. Once inside, Iceman goes down the corridor into Tombs' office. 4. He takes up a firing position with arms outstretched. 5. His gun jams, giving Tombs enough time to reach for his own weapon. 6. Iceman leaps onto him and the two men struggle. 7. The second gunman comes running down the hall and shouts, "Stand back." 8. Iceman lets go and the second man fires several shots into Tombs. 9. Iceman clears his weapon. 10. He pumps several more rounds into Tombs as he lies dying.
大人细只腰哩，我即使命间路家，准备十卡消息，啊我予大人拜晒手是用海哩。
Don't be shy. It's a question we all have to answer from time to time. And today, it's your turn. What can you do for the people around you?
It was a lovely piece of video, and it's available on YouTube and Vimeo, and I'm sure for Blast Theory's site. So please do watch the rest of it afterwards to see how it works out. But in the interest of time, let's move on. So we've talked a lot at great length, I think, probably about examples of discomfort. So we had 3 kind of lofty goals, and now we've seen that lots of people, of course, are already using discomfort in everything from kind of quite highbrow artistic cultural settings through to mainstream entertainment. As an HCI person, human-computer interaction person, what lessons might I draw from this? So the next bit is a kind of a bit of a cookbook, I suppose, for interaction design. What's going on here? And I think one of the things that is going on here is the use of discomfort. It's not the only thing that's going on in these experiences. You can't just say that's what Ulrika and Ayman is about, but that's what's strikingly interesting about its design and the experience when we started to study it. It's what got us thinking. And as we looked across these experiences, we essentially figured out that we thought there were at least 4 different aspects to the use of discomfort within these experiences that might provoke entertainment, enlightenment or sociality. These categories, being computer scientists, we have to abstract things out. These categories are conveniences for thinking about the subject. They don't define the world as it is. There are probably other forms of discomfort. They overlap in all sorts of complex ways, as we shall discuss. But if you wanted a starting point for thinking about it, I'd argue this is probably as good as any. So, okay, here's your 4 forms of discomfort, and here are some tactics to consider. Number 1, visceral discomfort. Discomfort that arises from visceral, physical sensations, ones that you might even feel internally in your body, the kind of shifting and changing of your organs, butterflies in your stomach and various other things. So if you want to create some visceral discomfort with people, how might you set about it? Well, one option, of course, lies in actually the design or form of the interaction devices that you choose. So the meat book, the rotting meat, and the gas mask with its rubber, sweaty, horrible smell are in themselves, before anything's happened to you beyond that, viscerally, very, very striking sensations, and for many people, quite uncomfortable. Second tactic might be to encourage strenuous physicality. So to some extent, roller coaster rides do this. They probably, for most of us, we don't very often pull 4.5 Gs or whatever you do on the bottom of oblivion. But you can do more to it than that. Joe Marshall's I Seek the Nerves with its strenuous running is very much about encouraging that physicality. And there's a movement at the moment in human-computer interaction led by Floyd Muller at RMIT in Melbourne, which is about exertion games. So Floyd has designed a series of physical games which do demand quite an intense physical engagement. Things like hanging off of ceiling bars while you're waiting for projected things to pass under your feet and various other things. So these are games that demand some strenuous engagement and interfaces that involve kicking and punching and so forth. And last of all, I should probably put on the list cause pain, because that clearly is a tactic that's used by the game controller. It's a tactic that's been used by various artworks that have required you to hold your hand on a surface as it heats up and information slowly plays out to you and various other things. But the discomfort you feel certainly isn't just about physical stuff. It's not just what's literally happening to your body. There are, of course, other things going on here too. Dealing with challenging themes and difficult decisions can be uncomfortable in all sorts of ways. We know this from watching films and that deal with dark themes. What's interesting about interactive experiences, of course, is they do more than show you stuff. They ask you to make decisions about stuff. They ask you to decide whether you do want to shoot something and kill it. Okay, many games don't have a very deep reflective loop involved in that decision, I must say, but you can create experiences that do bring people to a point of reflection about what they're doing. So that's one difference. And then, of course, the other thing is the cultural resonance of the device. So what does putting on a gas mask mean to you? I don't know. It may depend on whether you happen to be in the Imperial War Museum across the road or whether you happen to be in a fetish nightclub. It probably has very different resonances for what you think you're about to experience. That's all very general stuff. The final two tactics move much closer, I think, to notions of human-computer interaction because they strike at the core of what interacting with computers is about. If you're an interaction designer, there's a couple of things that are your business, really, and one of those is control. Human-computer interaction is all about control of the machine. And lots of people have written about that. If you turn to pretty much any standard HCI textbook, very early on you'll find Ben Schneiderman's 8 Golden Rules of Interaction Design. Rule number, can't quite remember, 6 or 7, I think. The locus of control shall remain with the user, it says. That means give people control of the machine as much as possible. That's good interaction design. So if you distort that relationship, you're going to make people feel pretty uncomfortable if you play with that relationship of control between them and the machine. So surrendering control to the machine. What is a roller coaster ride if not that? Sitting in a chair, strapped in, knowing that whatever happens in the next 2 minutes, they really are not going to stop the ride and let you get off. It doesn't matter what you say. And that's, of course, what the Bronco is playing with, but perhaps in a slightly more subtle way, where you start controlling the machine and you're brought to a tipping point, a realisation of loss of control. Surrender control to other people. That happens in Breathless. But of course, it's also happening in the blast theory works. Ulrika and Ayman compliant, the way the instructions work, that the various points you're brought to of turning back or not, are essentially asking you to give up more and more control if you want to pass through this experience. And that's something that can be discomforting. And the reverse, taking an unusual amount of control over someone else or a piece of machinery can, for some people, be an uncomfortable experience. And last up is intimacy. So I suppose if first and second wave HCI, or whatever they're called, I can never remember, if that was really all about control, usability, controlling the machine, the mouse, the keyboard and all that stuff, then more recent HCI has been all about intimacy. All everyone cares about these days is social media and collaborative uses of computing. And that's all about constructing social relationships between people. So now computers are intimately bound up in our social relationships. And again, if you start to distort those relationships and play with them, you're going to quite quickly make people feel fairly uncomfortable. So isolation is, I think, a really critical tactic in pretty much all of these experiences. And I guess, if you're an artist or an experienced designer, you're probably inherently aware of the fact that it's actually quite important to get people on their own at times, lost and confused, focused on what you want to show them, or possibly focused on their own feelings in a heightened sense. That message is not so familiar to interaction designers. A lot of people think that social media is all about getting people together, but getting people on their own is key, and isolation really, really can make you feel exposed. Intimacy with strangers is a tricky one. Most of us have got pretty strict social barriers about what we are and aren't prepared to do with strangers. So various pieces of work, I didn't talk about it here, but the piece of work called Mediated Body, which saw not so long ago, exhibited at Kai last year, and I'm sure lots of others in this genre require you to do things like touch a performer's body, and in that case in order to generate a soundscape. So now you're put in a position of having to get really close to someone and touch them. Not only that, in that case you did it in public as well. One-on-one performances, we did a piece of work called Anywhere a few years ago in Nottingham that brought you to a point where you had a kind of one-on-one dance performance with someone, and That's a really uncomfortable experience when you're used to the anonymity of being in an audience, and you know, it's really, I found it deeply uncomfortable. And then employing surveillance and voyeurism. So that's what's going on with Brendan's early experiments on the theme park rides, is an intimate close-up view of an experience you wouldn't normally see. At the end of Ulrika and Ayman Compliant, as you're led away from the interview room, you pass by a window that turns out to be a one-way mirror that looks back into the room, and they allow you to linger for 30 seconds to hear the interview of the next person before you're sort of tugged away in a way that makes you feel slightly guilty for having done it. So a number of these works involve us observing people in a way that we might not normally do so, or possibly even realising that we are being observed, observing people going through difficult things. So, that's a dangerous thing to do. I'm sure it isn't for you, because you're all very thoughtful, grown-up people. I'm sure if I was talking to my students, it'd be a horribly dangerous thing to do and say, here is 9 ways of making people feel uncomfortable. Go out into the world and multiply. That's not the point. If we go back to the beginning of the talk, the point, of course, was you're trying to do this in light of other goals. What were they again? Entertainment, enlightenment, sociality. And that means that, of course, discomfort is part of some other experience. It's probably not the end goal in itself, at least not in the work that I want to do, but part of a journey. Well, what might that journey look like? Well, I guess it's a trajectory through discomfort. So in this case, taken Freitag, is it? So Gabriella tells me classic 5-act structure of theatre, and tried to suggest to you that that's what a roller coaster is like. There's an exposition, there's an initial framing of the experience, a backstory, some things that even go on in the queue. Do you really want to go on? It's not too late to turn back. There's rising action as you climb up that first climb. There's a climactic moment, usually the first drop. There's a cathartic bit that passes on for about a minute after that, as you may even actually enjoy the visceral sensation of acceleration and movement. And a denouement, you buy a mug or a t-shirt at the end. And if you don't think that's true, I offer you this picture of Oblivion, the world's first vertical drop roller coaster. And if that isn't Freitag's 5-act structure of performance made physical in the form of a roller coaster, then I don't know what is. So the talk that I'm not going to give is about trajectories, but that is in the book. So more generally, it's interesting to think about defining all sorts of experiences that we have as trajectories of different kinds that we pass through. And in the book, Gabriella and I talk about the world being made of just 3 kinds of trajectories. That's all there is. Canonical, the plan, the script, the artist's intention, the layout, whatever they wanted to happen. Participant, what people actually do, which diverges from canonical trajectories in all sorts of ways and has to be orchestrated back to them. And then the historic, which is the retelling of what they did. And I won't give the talk of the book, please read it, but I will just say that I suppose the one that's neglected, I think, in most experiences is the historic trajectory. I think we're still good at giving people experiences that feel great, but we're not very good at giving them the resources to talk about them afterwards. You know, why whenever you watch a TV programme or go to a film or a theme park, don't you get a rich set of resources to let you reflect, recount and retell your experience to others? Well, we don't have time to answer that question, and I really wish we didn't have time to dabble into this topic, in which whenever I touch it there are people in any audience who know so much more than I do. So I'll open the box and then I'll run from the room. I suppose it raises the question of ethics, really. It certainly has for us practically, because we're researchers, and so we live in a space where you do research ethics, and if you have to pretend that what you're doing is an experiment, that's kind of quite hard, and you then have to write ethically about how you're going to manage that. This isn't about research ethics. This is what I would say is more about the ethics of practice. So if you wanted to practice those tactics, how might you think about that ethically? Well, first of all, what kind of broad justification could there ever be for making people feel uncomfortable? It's a good question. There's a couple of ways you might approach this. I guess Jeremy Benford, there he is, stuffed in his box at University College London, where he still lives. Poetic justice, I guess, after inventing the panopticon prison. argues for consequentialism. So that's, I guess, a school of ethics that argues, bluntly, my understanding, that maybe sometimes the end justifies the means. You can't just cite that, it doesn't make you ethical. You have to weigh the ends and the means and argue for them and against them with other people to justify your position. But I guess in my talk, that's probably the position I've been taking. I've been trying to suggest that making people feel uncomfortable is okay, perhaps, if you do it right, as long as those people, that's my position, enjoy the benefits of entertainment, enlightenment or sociality at the end of it. Or you might follow Immanuel Kant and argue that it's an individual's right to choose either to express themselves artistically through discomfort or to engage in practices that make them uncomfortable too. And that's okay, that's a line of argument you can make, but you have to argue it in each case, and it's tricky. So if I'm designing a roller coaster ride that does this, and it's interactive, and you can control the level of thrill you have, but what happens if we go on it as a group? Most roller coaster rides are shared group experiences. Maybe not everyone in the group quite shares the group leader's view. Perhaps some people are being press-ganged into having an experience that they'd rather not have. So you need to think about these things. Which brings me, we don't want to look at close-up Jeremy Benford, one's enough. Brings me to my kind of final few comments, and I'm not going to unpack these issues in any great detail, but other than having a high position on how might you even approach the ethical question, there are actually some practical ethical issues to think about in the details of it. If you are writing down the case, there's a number of things you need to think about. And again, if I suppose kind of put on the research ethics hat for a moment, these kind of experiences challenge a number of the things that are sort of taken for granted when we have these discussions about, is the piece of work you want to do ethical? So a classic is informed consent. That's something that if you do research based in a kind of medical or psychological tradition, you'll be asked to think about, have people given informed consent for this? And what does it mean to be informed and what does it mean to consent? And it's pretty hard in these experiences where you don't know strictly what's going to happen to you, because that's part of the unfolding nature of the experience. So those roller coasters that are in the dark, for example, that's a genre, black rides or dark rides. So how you manage informed consent in the framing of an experience is an interesting question. We already touched upon the right to withdraw. So again, you pretty much can't withdraw from a roller coaster once it's underway. We did some studies of sort of some rides, and we did see examples where people really were pretty genuinely horribly scared, and I'm sure really did want to get on, and seemed to me that the ride operators probably pretend they don't know. And personal opinion, that's probably the right thing to do, because if it takes 90 seconds to finish a ride, it probably takes 5 minutes to get somebody off of a ride anyway. So, once you're on it and the machine's rolling, it's rolling. But what does the right to withdraw from something mean? That's a cherished kind of part of research ethics. What does it mean in this context? Managing risk, of course, but that professional practice is widely carried out in all sorts of artistic and mainstream entertainment settings. That's part and parcel of being a creative person. And last of all, privacy and anonymity. So, again, those are mainstream questions you'll be asked about, certainly if you're doing research ethics, is what's happening to the data and who sees it and where is it held? Can people have it deleted? These are all things you think about all the time. And yet I'm advocating making experiences where we use voyeurism and other people get to see them. So how are you going to manage that? You may notice I'm not giving you any answers to these questions. Just me raising questions and running away. So that is pretty much all I want to say. I think I've probably spoken for far too long, so I'm really happy to take questions on any of this. If you're generally interested in the works that I've set out, both Brendan's works and quite a number of Blaster's works documented in the book, as is the whole notion of trajectories. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'll shut up. Thank you.